You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. Hello and welcome to Mamamia Out Loud. It's what women are actually talking about on Monday, the 25th of September. I'm Holly Wainwright.
I'm Mia Freedman.
And I'm Clare Stevens.
And on the show today, Linda, Naomi, Christy, Cindy, the supermodels Generation X grew up looking at, have made a documentary. And after watching it, I have a question. Are beautiful women just bad for the rest of us? Also, we are in the middle of an intense advertising blitz around the Voice to Parliament, and one side is clearly winning. Why? And you don't know it, but if you want to continue using Instagram for what we know you're secretly using Instagram for, you might need to get yourself a Finsta. We explain. But first, Clare Stevens.
In case you missed it, a woman has fallen pregnant while she was already pregnant.
No.
Is it you?
It is not me. It is not me. A couple in Perth, David and Sandra, found out while pregnant with their daughter Poppy, who was conceived naturally, that they were also pregnant with their son Michael via IVF.
So not twins?
Well, technically they are twins. The term is superfetation twins, and there are 10 confirmed cases around the world. So biologically, these twins are 18 days apart. But they were born on the same day in April of this year, and one, Michael, was early, Poppy was full term. But because Michael was 18 days behind, he was a lot smaller and had to spend a little bit more time in hospital. But experts say it's likely there are a lot more unreported cases of this. There are just 10 cases that are kind of confirmed. It's because of IVF and then conceiving naturally.
I've heard about it happening, or I've read about it happening twice naturally, like not an IVF. So it's like you release an egg and it gets fertilized and it implants. And then that's meant to be the sign to your body to stop releasing eggs. But then sometimes doesn't get the message.
That's so fun.
Because your ovaries were looking at its phone and not paying attention.
They went, oh, sorry.
And didn't realise you were already pregnant, so it just sends out another one.
Sorry, we went again.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
It wasn't about the fashion. It was about the women. That's what a supermodel is.
A new 4-part documentary dropped on Apple TV over the weekend, and it blew up many a Gen X group chat, or maybe just mine. The Supermodels has reunited 4 of the biggest supermodels from the 90s, Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, Christy Turlington, and Linda Evangelista. What became really apparent watching these 4 women who are now in their 50s is that at the peak of their careers, when they were at the absolute centre of the zeitgeist and their fame was the equivalent of like the Beatles or now the Kardashians, they really were the original influences. And they were groundbreaking because they knew their worth and they knew their power, and they used their beauty to become brands in and of themselves. And they also became businesses, some more successfully than others, because before the supers, nobody knew models' names and they were just used as sort of these dispensable, interchangeable tools by designers and advertisers. But the supermodels had power and they used it. And this doco really looks at some of the ugly things that went on behind the scenes during those heady years in the 90s, like racism and sexual harassment and abuse, and there's some heartbreaking parts to it. And then also the difficult years afterwards where they all had to navigate what it means to age out of your job. I felt really nostalgic because I was starting my own career in magazines at that time, and writing about these women and following their lives was literally my job. All the revelations from the documentary have caused a lot of people to sort of reflect about what our ideas of supermodels are. And some people have, I suppose, quite predictably been complaining, and you would expect me to be one of them, but I'm not actually, that the supermodels were terrible for women collectively because they established these impossible beauty standards that none of us could ever live up to. But Hol, you disagree.
I do disagree. It was interesting to me that I was watching this on Friday night, like possibly the perfect conditions for watching this if you're a Generation X woman, right? My kids had just gone to bed. Brent was out. I had a glass of pink wine with some ice in it. I had some dip.
Living the dream.
And I just binged this. And I was literally in heaven. And what I realised, it's beautifully made, right? And they're all cooperating, so it's very profesh, very glossy. just looking at them and revisiting all these fashion shoots and all these spreads and all these shows, like I just loved looking at them. And I was examining it and I'd noticed that I didn't have one iota of resentment towards any of these women for what they look like, which is kind of weird, really, right? Because I was young when I started staring at these women. I remember I've said on the show before I was even working, before I was even at uni, I used to go and buy, with the little money I had, fashion magazines and just stare at them. And I knew all their names. I didn't know anything else about them really and didn't really care, but I just liked looking at them. And it made me think that now I think we have a relationship with beauty, and I think probably made worse by social media in lots of ways, that's brought us really close to it, and we're supposed to want to attain it. So if only you try hard enough, diet enough, get enough surgery, spend enough money on beauty creams, you too can look like the influencers on your phones. It never occurred to me even once that I should look like the supermodels, because who the fuck looks like the supermodels? They're like these exotic creatures in a zoo, which I know is problematic in itself, to look at these women and just be like, it's like looking at a tiger. You know what I mean?
Or like watching the Olympics. Like you can watch the Olympics and marvel at these incredible feats, but you never thought, if I just did something, I could high jump that high or swim that fast.
Yeah.
You're right.
It's like they're a very specific thing. And it's really interesting listening to them talk, because the four women all came to modelling in different ways. Some of them really wanted it from an early age. Others were more like happened to bump into a scout, whatever. And they're very different people. It's interesting to see the shoots. There's no pretending that wasn't lighting and makeup and the best photographers in the world and the best designers in the world and all those things creating art. And it sounds so wanky to say, but that extra layer of glass sort of in between us and them was probably really good for us. Do you know what I mean? Like mentally. I didn't think, oh, that's attainable. I didn't aspire to it. I was like, these people were born to do that in the way that some people are born incredibly intelligent.
I remember having a similar thought growing up. I remember learning about people would come to our school and talk to us about, don't compare yourself to the people on the front covers of magazines, and try and give us a body image talk. And I felt like yelling, I'm not comparing myself to the person on the front cover of a magazine. I'm comparing myself to the girl next to me.
Yeah, right.
Who is freaking beautiful, and I don't feel beautiful.
But don't you also think, like, as 100%, but also as it became less supermodel-y culture and it became more girl next door-y and more actresses on the TV and more now influencers on Instagram, they are slightly more attainable, but it makes it almost worse?
Well, I always thought, okay, I'm comparing myself to my peers rather than the people in the media. However, all the research shows that while perhaps we're not consciously telling ourselves that we're comparing ourselves to what these people look like, we are absorbing it. And there are all sorts of studies where when this type of media, this 80s and 90s media, infiltrated a country where it hadn't been before, when it infiltrated a different population, eating disorders went up, body image issues went up. I think there's a difference between consciously feeling it and consciously being aware of that comparison and unconsciously absorbing the fact that this is what we're heralding as perfection in media. I remember seeing a picture when I was growing up of, I think it was Brooke Shields, and she was in like a bathtub, and she would have been a very, very young teenager. And I remember looking at her limbs and just getting this pang of, who has limbs that are that long?
Well, what you're talking about is beauty standards, right? I agree with you. I didn't directly compare myself, but I also did, because I was literally swimming in the soup of it as a consumer, but then also it was my job working in magazines that had these women in their covers. I had to write stories about them all the time. I interviewed a couple, and like, they were glamazons. They were larger than life, and they were completely unattainable. And when you look at what came after them, which was grunge, what's interesting about that time compared to now, and we looking at this when we relook at a whole lot of 90s cultural moments, from Monica Lewinsky to the O.J. Simpson trial and our treatment and our view of women, is back then we didn't deconstruct things. And I wonder if it's because it predated a time of the internet. The opinions that were being published and that were out there were still very gatekept, you know? So it wasn't just regular women saying
it would be
things.
feminist texts were obviously there
Yeah.
that were talking about beauty standards.
Because why do I love those women so unconditionally and yet Emrata drives me insane? Why?
Well, I would argue that it's because Emrata is closer to you.
I would argue that it's, and this is a little bit screwed up, I think, because Emrata has stuff to say and that feels incompatible because the thing
That's
about
always
these
my
women,
argument about why I think she annoys you.
yeah, and like looking at these women, I didn't watch the documentary, but I've seen the trailer and I've read a lot about it. And there's all this stuff about how they help break down barriers and it wasn't about the hair and the makeup or the fashion, it was about the women and it's all this stuff. And I'm like, no, it wasn't. It was solely, they had their photographs taken, they were on the covers of magazines. They were not
I disagree.
opinionated in the way that people like Emrata
They
are
weren't
opinionated.
opinionated, but two things that they did talk about. One is that they knew their worth. That quote from Linda Evangelista about we don't get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day. Now, that would be seen in these days as hustle, you go girl, do your power poses. Then they were destroyed. And you had magazine editors and designers coming out and saying they're too arrogant, they're too confident, they're too spoiled because they were earning money.
It threatened their business model.
It threatened them. And the other thing that they did do, which was use their power, they became aware that Naomi Campbell was not getting booked for the same jobs that they were. And they said, we will not walk your runway. We will not do your campaign unless you also book Naomi. Now, they didn't have an Instagram account that they could publish that on, and they didn't do a lot of interviews where they spoke about that, but they still did it.
There's a brilliant bit in this because when they get to the part about how when the tide turned on the supermodels because they were so expensive, John Casablancas, who's this very, very famous modelling magnate who's massively problematic and now has lots of sexual assault charges against him, he's literally talking about what a bunch of entitled bitches they are while sitting in the back of a limo sipping champagne.
Yeah.
And you're just like, this world was wild. You know, I have a lot of sympathy, Claire, for the argument that we don't like beautiful women who talk. I'll pay that. But I also just think it was a different time. I'm not saying there's nothing problematic about them because there is, right? Even when you hear them tell their stories, and you should watch it because it's really interesting, right? They were way too young. They were like 15 years old and being sent off to live in model share houses in New York City, and their mums were like, I'm sure nothing bad will happen. Yeah, sure. You know, they were all, with obviously the exception of Naomi, who said white, they were all way too thin. Of course it's problematic. And of course the beauty standards imposed by the fashion industry needed to be blown up. And they are in the process of that. We're still not there. But I still feel like in some ways the fact that Emrata, and not even Emrata, but more all the beautiful influencers who aren't 6 foot tall with legs up to their neck and know all their angles for a shoot, but they're living in my phone and in my daughter's phone pretending like they're normal people.
Oh, yes.
And I don't mean that them individually are pretending, but, you know, it's sold to me in that way. Whereas this level of beauty and stardom and iconism was never sold to me as if it could be me. I remember the first time I ever saw a supermodel in the flesh, because I didn't work in that level of magazines at this time, and it wasn't one of them. It was Megan Gale or someone, you know, not quite as. It was like seeing an alien. They're just not made like
Or a
most of us.
superhero.
And so it's just a complete fluke of genetics that these women look the way they do. All of the childhood pictures in this are hilarious because they're standing next to their sisters, most of them, and they just look from a very early age very different to everybody else.
But what does that mean about the fashion industry? I get that
it's
on
screwed.
a more personal level, you're feeling some distance from it. But what does it mean about an industry? I mean, we're all buying clothes. We're all going to clothes shops. We're all buying things. Part of this system that is based on the fact that all women should have these willowy bodies that none of us friggin' have, it's almost more insidious, that it's more subtle.
I agree entirely that the reckoning that's come to a point for the fashion industry had to come. Thank God. Catwalks are way more diverse now. I don't look back in nostalgia as in, oh, I wish it was like that now. I think the fashion industry was enormously problematic and probably still is. But Mia's right that these women were the first ones to go, actually, we want a piece of this. And they exerted power in a way. And that's why the fashion industry turned on them. And it's a really interesting story about a moment in time. So it's not perfect. And the politics of it are certainly not perfect. I don't know, I just found it so interesting to look back on an era that was so different to this one where we're constantly being told if we just try hard enough, we too can be beautiful. You know that I have a love-hate relationship with TikTok, my friends. Clare Stevens very big on TikTok. Mia likes the TikTok too, always getting trapped in strange corners of it. I am on and off it. And if you're not a big TikTok person, you might not know it has a hypersensitive algorithm. So it's supposed to have the best personalization feature for you. But I will stand here and say it's never nailed me. Every time I go on it, I get weird things. I'm like, you're not making my life better. Go away.
You don't spend enough time on it.
I think this is it, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, this weekend I went back on it for various reasons. And I was immediately flooded with vote no ads for the Voice to Parliament, of course.
The first reason I'm voting no to the Voice to Parliament.
What I'm about to say is entirely my personal perspective as a yes voter.
I say no to the Voice to Parliament.
I wanted to give one practical reason as to why I think the Voice to Parliament is going to be a good idea.
And apparently this is not just me. Young Australians, who are the demographic most likely to be on TikTok, obviously, are also the demographic most likely to vote yes. And yet on TikTok, the No campaign, largely under the banner Organisation of Fair Australia, has more than 21 million plays. And all the data collected around what's working on TikTok and what's not will show you that the no is outperforming the yes by an astonishing amount. That 21 million on the Fair Australia ads is compared with about 1 million on the Yes campaign and the Uluru Statement campaign and the Yes 23 campaign. So the No camp is blitzing TikTok and it seems winning the debate. Support for the Voice sat at almost 70% yes last year, before the debate and the campaign started, really. That means that in passing, in principle, if Australians thought about it at all, they kind of went, sounds right, sure. That support has been dropping and dropping and dropping, and it's now sitting at around 35 to 40%, depending on what poll you look at. Now, polls aren't always right, and in fact, people will say the only one that matters is on the day. You always say that, particularly when you're losing in the polls, but they're not always right. We've seen lots of upsets in this over the last few years. But what I want to know is, why is it often the more conservative side of politics? And it is reflected in the polling that, of course, not everyone who's voting no is conservative, but if you broke it down along party lines, you are more likely to vote no if you're on the conservative side of politics and more likely to vote yes if you're on the progressive side of politics. Why is it that often the conservative side of politics are dominating messaging when it comes to this kind of political advertising? Clare Stevens, you understand TikTok better than I do. What is going on there?
We know that polarizing content is what works on social media, and the yes content isn't polarizing in the same way that the no content has been. So the John Farnham ad isn't angry or controversial in the same way that Jacinta Price giving a address at the National Press Club.
Could I ask you, please, do you believe the history of colonisation continues to have an impact on some Indigenous Australians?
I'll be honest with you, no, I don't think so. Aboriginal Australians, many of us, have the same opportunities as all other Australians in this country.
That's polarising, and that is going to get hundreds and thousands of comments and a whole lot of shares of people saying, I cannot believe somebody said this, and
which then increases its visibility.
Exactly, and it's going to start a debate in the comments. That's how it works. I mean, the way to get any traction on social media is to have an unpopular opinion, an opinion with tension in it. We talk about it all the time. When we are publishing stories, there needs to be tension in the headline. If there's no tension, nobody clicks. Interestingly, I'm not sure if it's as simple as conservative versus progressive politics, that, you know, conservative stuff does well and progressive stuff doesn't, because I actually think it's the progressive no that seems to be getting the most traction on social media, which is the Indigenous people saying, actually, this isn't what we want. And there was this great article in The Conversation that kind of broke down all the TikTok engagement in the Voice referendum. And it said that this Fair Australia account, which is the one that's doing a lot of the no campaign content, what they've done is there's 3 key elements that are really cutting through. One is authenticity, and that's because they're prioritising Indigenous no supporters. So they've got Jacinta Price, they've got members of Indigenous communities.
I'm a brother, an elder. I'm a mama. I'm a daughter. I love my family, and I don't want people to look at them differently.
I don't want others to look at me differently.
I'm just like any other Australian. I'm an Australian, same as you.
We are one mob. I've decided to vote no.
Because the voice will divide us.
And as soon as you see an Indigenous person saying, I don't want the voice, you're going to listen because there's tension in that. Then use of personal narratives, exactly the same thing, and humour. They've been really effective at using TikTok trends and using what's big on the platform in order to get their message across. Now,
Can you give me an example?
I mean, the Jacinta Price National Press Club address has been the single most viral piece of content. I think people would argue that there was an element of humour to it when she was talking about the difference between coming from a line of Indigenous people who had been persecuted and then she went through the British side who were all convicts and criminals and how that is a problematic history as well. She was going for a bit of a gag. But they've also got just like the funny voice effects.
Before you vote in this year's referendum, you need to know who this guy is. His name is Thomas Mayo. He's the architect behind The Voice who literally wrote the book on the proposal. While the Prime Minister goes around claiming The Voice is just a, quote, modest request, the activists behind The Voice have plans for something far more powerful.
They're using the platform in the way that it's meant to be used.
Exactly.
Right?
So the Yes campaign is a lot more earnest.
Listening works. Teams listen to their coaches. Children listen to their parents. Well, some of the time. When we listen, we understand. When we understand, we can help. But for the last 250 years, we haven't listened to the people who have been here for 65,000. It's time we did. Vote yes to a voice and better recognition for Indigenous Australians.
Yes, and people might argue that the Yes campaign hasn't put the resources into TikTok because it doesn't need to, because that's the audience they already have. So TikTok is 18 to 34 pretty much, and they're the ones who are overwhelmingly voting yes. So maybe the Yes campaign has gone, that's not where we need to be. We need to be elsewhere.
Do we think they hate watching the No campaign videos then, if we're looking at these really skewed numbers of who's engaging with this content?
I think I know that I hate watch it. And then what's so frustrating is you watch it and go, I can't believe someone said that. And then you get more and more and more. And I can see how people who might be kind of teetering on the edge get radicalised. But, I mean, we've seen such a huge swing.
Not that you have to be radical to vote no. And we know that there are outlouders who will be voting no and there are outlouders who will be voting yes. It's important to acknowledge that.
Yes, but people who might be on the fence are getting stronger ideas because of what they're seeing on social media. We know that that's
how
a trend.
Advertising works if it's effective. I think it's interesting what you were saying earlier, Hol, about how conservative groups seem to be so much more effective at winning hearts and minds. And some other examples would be Brexit or Trump. And I was thinking about this and, you know, we looked at the other referendum about Australia becoming a republic. Same there, that didn't get up. One exception being same-sex marriage, which I want to get to in a second. But the reason that I think that's the case is that the whole word progressive is about change, right? And people generally don't like change. So it's very easy to scare someone or convince someone to not vote for change because it's easier to just stay with the status quo. That's why referendums almost never get up. So then when you look at, for example, Brexit did that, let's not change. So you play up all the risks, you play up all the downsides. Even Donald Trump's campaign around Make America Great Again, that speaks explicitly to things are changing, let's go backwards to the way things were.
It's also simple, without wanting to sound too partisan about it. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. Like it's kind of vague. Like the Brexit one is a good example. The Leave campaign for Brexit was take back control. So 3-word slogan, right? What does that mean? But it doesn't really matter what it means.
That was a change, wasn't it?
Yes.
So I've argued against myself.
Yeah, that was a change.
Yeah.
Whereas the stay didn't really have a slogan. It was just remain, let's remain. So that was a case where people voted for change. But I was reading some analysis that said in a case like The Voice, because it is a relatively complicated issue, and I know that it's not a complicated issue when you break it down, but the idea of changing the constitution and then it leading to this body, you have to get your head around a couple of things. And to your point about people don't like change, the Yes campaign has a harder job because they've got to make like a cohesive narrative of what this is and why you should want it. Whereas the No campaign can benefit from the confusion that most people have. And that's kind of the same with, you know, Take Back Control, or I'm not necessarily comparing them to political issues, but it doesn't really mean anything. But it sounds like something you want to do, you know, and it's quite straightforward. And I think that with the no, don't know, vote no, it just benefits from all the confusion and the noise.
I remember a few years ago I listened to the most extraordinary podcast episode about why the gay rights movement has managed to make so much progress in such a relatively short period of time compared to any other civil rights movement. And the reason that it explained for this is that when people started to come out, probably kicked off by Ellen DeGeneres, to be honest, and around that time, because so many people were closeted before then, suddenly people realised, oh, my mum, my daughter, my friend, my workmate, my sister, my brother, people suddenly discovered that there were gay people that they knew that they already loved. So the love was already there. And when we had the referendum for marriage equality, it personally touched almost everybody in Australia, because by then almost everybody could say that they knew and probably loved someone who was gay, and they could say, okay, I want them to have the same rights as me. So in that case, it was quite simple. Whereas because Indigenous people are such a small percentage of the population, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of disengagement, because there are a lot of people who've never even met someone who's Indigenous, let alone have them in their family or in their social circle or in their workplace. When all the research has come out about how disengaged people are, I think that's a big explanation for it.
Interestingly, what we know about social psychology is that the way to beat stigma and kind of overcome issues like homophobia, in the example of the same-sex marriage plebiscite, is those personal experiences and personal connections. And where the No campaign has gone is really platforming and focusing on Indigenous Australian voices saying no. It's kind of that simple.
And I think that's why so many non-Indigenous people are nervous about voting on an issue that doesn't directly affect them, or about which they don't have enough information or lived experience.
But I would argue that in every case when you're ever being asked to vote for anything, you're voting for a whole nation, like a whole bunch of people. You're not only voting on, it's like, what kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of country do you want to live in? What do you want for everybody around you? I mean, of course, we're motivated by our own personal pocket, my backyard, all the rest of it. But I think that the issue is about how do you get the message to be clear enough that says this is good for everybody, if that's what your message is. If that's what the Yes campaign's message is that this is good for everybody, it's good for the nation, it's good for Australia, it's good for us in the eyes of the world, all those things. That's the message you've got to get out there. And I would argue that, as Clare said at the beginning, it's harder to sell a positive message than a negative one, which is so counterintuitive. The only time I could think of a really positive message was Obama's Yes, We Can.
And that was a moment in time.
And that was a moment in time, right, is a positive motion forward, like, yes. And again, it doesn't really mean anything. But it's got this motion. And I think that if it gets defeated, if it's a no vote, people will study this hard, because how Peter Dutton and his groups really have managed to take it from a 70% support to where it is now is quite the marketing feat.
I feel like one of the problems with social media is that our attention spans and our worlds have become so small that somehow watching one Indigenous person say, I don't support The Voice, that grabs our attention and occupies more brain space than the fact that we know that has come out of so many polls that over 80% of Indigenous people support The Voice. It's like that one example trumps the fact of the bigger population statistic, because Statistics are less interesting than a single voice.
Outlouders, you might already know, but if you don't, we did a special episode with Carly Williams. She is the ABC National Indigenous Affairs reporter, and she hosts a podcast about the voice referendum. And we got all your questions because Outlouders sent us a lot of questions in, and we put them to Carly, and she answered them brilliantly, beautifully, clearly. It's an absolute must listen if you're still wondering which way to vote in a few weeks' time.
If you want to make Mamamia Out Loud part of your routine 5 days a week, we release segments on Tuesdays and Thursdays just for Mamamia subscribers. To get full access, follow the link in the show notes, and a big thank you to all our current subscribers. Writer Shannon Finlay wrote an article for Mamamia over the weekend called I Have a Fake Instagram, Here's Why You Need One Too. In it, she explained why everyone should have a Finsta, a fake Insta, or a burner account.
Do you have one?
I do. I do have one. I'm like, should I admit that? Yes, I do.
Great.
But a burner account, in case you missed it, is an anonymous social media account that people use for online activities that they don't want linked to their main account.
And it's called Finsta.
Because it's fake Insta.
It's a
fake
Finsta.
Instagram.
Yeah.
It's the kind of account you create knowing you can delete it at the drop of a hat. It's got no personal information. You are using it for stalking purposes, for gossip purposes.
So to be clear, a Finsta, it doesn't have photos on it. It's not like a fake identity.
You're not catfishing anyone.
Pretending to be someone else. So you make an account and it's just like
Silly Girl 101.
And there's no photos and it's set to private.
Yeah.
And you've got no followers and you don't follow anyone.
Correct.
Okay.
So
why?
Shannon explained one purpose of her fake Instagram. And she wrote that she met this guy and they were casually dating, but then he mysteriously vanished from her following and followers lists on Instagram. When she asked him about it, he was like, oh, lol, Instagram hates me. No, that's not a thing. So clever Shannon went, obviously I'm going to use my burner account and follow not just him, his ex-girlfriend. And I'm going to go really deep.
What?
And what she discovered was
this is a lot of work.
This guy and the ex-girlfriend were interstate together visiting his parents. So she caught him red-handed and she said, I have saved myself at least a few months of wasted time, blocked him and moved on. Imagine how much of my life I might have given to someone who would be so dishonest and lacked so much integrity.
Sleuthing paid off in her eyes.
This is interesting because my knowledge and understanding of Finsta accounts, of which I've heard about for many years, is teenagers using them to keep things secret from their parents. Because often when you let your kids get their first social account or go on Instagram, you're like, but I have to follow you.
Yeah.
That's how it starts.
That's how it starts.
And then they outsmart you and they've got Finstas and they post smiley, happy photos of them doing their homework on their Finsta. And then they have another one where they're vaping and, you know, doing whatever.
And then there's also famous people like Prince Harry's Spiky Mouse account that he used to connect with Meghan Markle. They use fake Instagram accounts to maintain anonymity and kind of connect with each other. And Jennifer Aniston admitted that she had a fake Instagram account, and here's what she said about it.
You had a fake Instagram account, though, didn't you?
Well, it was a stalker account, yes.
Yeah, right.
When I was thinking about doing this, I sort of figured it was time to kind of understand the world and dip my toe into the sort of social media pool.
You know, the young people, the kids, will call it a Finstagram, which is short for fake Instagram, and they mostly
They can't even say fake anymore.
Bless her. She is such a boomer.
I love her.
She makes me feel young and hip with the kids.
I know.
It's so true.
So the celebrities use it. You're right. Teenagers use it. Mia, do you have a fake Instagram? And what do you use it for?
I don't have a fake Instagram because what I didn't realise that if you look at someone's stories, they can see who looked at their stories. They get a list. So I've a couple of times popped in to watch someone's live or whatever and it's been, hi, Mia. And I'm like, oh, wait, can you see me?
Yes.
And so I did not realise that. I'm more careful now.
I've got a friend starting a fake Insta to stalk her teenage son's girlfriends. That's the kind of use case that we're talking about here. So she's thinking, my sons are starting to date. I want to know who they're dating. They would be mortified if they saw me looking at their stories. So I'm going to do a fake account and look at it through that. And I was like, that sounds like a lot of work. And she was like, what could be more important?
She's like, I don't understand. How else would I spend my time?
Hard relate.
Claire, you've got a recommendation for us?
Guys, you need to watch the brand new season of Sex Education. It's dropped on Netflix.
Hi, I'm Otis Milburn, and I am incredibly awkward, and I struggle with public speaking. And I am also a bit of a mess. I didn't kiss anyone until I was 16 years old, and I've had problems wanking and fingering. I suffer from anxiety, and I feel misunderstood a lot of the time. I've had my heart broken by people I like, and I've hurt people who like me. So I am a mess, but I think all teenagers are, and I think that's why it's so important that we can talk.
And I don't care what anyone says, because there has been some criticism of it, and I'm not listening.
Tell me why I should keep going, because I'm a little fatigued by it. It feels a little samey. I loved the first season. Second season was quite good.
I dropped off in season 2.
Yeah.
Absolutely love it. So it's the British teen sex comedy drama following Otis, who's an awkward high school student who gives sex advice to his peers and his group of friends. And I just think it is the most fresh, original piece of television.
Very explicit.
In recent years. So explicit.
No, it sounds like Jennifer Aniston.
The first season, I thought it was one of the most interesting things I've seen.
Agree.
I always get anxiety when I'm watching something set in a high school, though, because I'm like, they're going to age out. They're only going to be so many seasons. How have they handled that?
College.
Yeah, yeah. I can understand if people have tuned out, and I think I know why. Otis is actually the weakest link. The main character is the weakest link. It's the supporting characters who are the greatest. So it's Eric, his best friend, who is just a talent unlike any other. In this season, he's suddenly cool at their new school. There's Maeve, who's studying in the US, and she's plunged into this whole new world. There's Adam, who's one of my favourite characters, just the most believable teenage boy who's dropped out of school to start a job on a farm, has no idea what he's doing. There are storylines that you do not see anywhere else on television, and you are fascinated.
Like what?
Okay, so in one of the very early episodes, there's a guy who is receiving a blowjob from a girl, and she sticks her finger up his bum and he orgasms, and then he has this whole crisis about whether he's a gay man. And I'm like, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I found that a lot to look at.
I think it's so fresh.
Sex and the City was doing that kind of stuff in the 90s.
That's actually true. What it does really well is inclusivity and diversity.
Yeah.
Like it depicts that in such a positive way. And some of the criticism about this season in particular is that it's gone too far and that it feels a bit self-conscious how inclusive it is. Some people have said that it feels a bit like a box-ticking exercise.
Which I disagree. I think it's self-aware. I think it knows what it's doing and it knows what it's trying to portray.
I have only one question. Is Gillian Anderson still in it?
Yes, of course.
She is. I mean,
and she's a new mum.
Yeah.
She's got baby Joy. She's very
interesting.
stressed. Hannah Gadsby's in it.
Oh, yeah.
Hannah Gadsby's like a radio producer. You just have to watch it. It is so funny, and I just want the Outlouders to watch it, and then I want to talk about it.
Tell us what you think, Outlouders. Sex Education Season 4 is on Netflix. And if you're looking for something else to listen to, last week on our subscriber episode, we had an emergency meeting about the direction of the show, and we got a bit honest, and it wasn't biffo, but there was certainly some disagreement. The topics we love to talk about and the topics that we loathe, and they're very different topics. There's a link in the show notes if you want to listen to that right now.
Thank you for listening to Australia's #1 news and pop culture show. This episode was produced by Emeline Gazilas. The assistant producer is Tahli Blackman, with audio production by Leah Porges. Goodbye.
Bye.
Shout out to any Mamamia subscribers listening. If you love the show and you want to support us, subscribing to Mamamia is the very best way to do it. There's a link in the episode description.